How's life in the Netherlands? Except for like the terribly boiling hot weather that we also have here? It's like scorching hot.
I feel really privileged to be living here in the Netherlands, I have to say. The quality of life and the standard of living is much higher than even my home country of England. But I moved here just before the pandemic. And so I've had a very skewed view, I guess, of what life is like here. But the Netherlands is an interesting place to live. Until I moved here, I didn't realize. I guess you never realize until you move to a place exactly what a place is like, no matter how many times you visit. It was the same when I moved to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Vancouver. It was great places to live, and then you actually see all maybe the problems or some of the difficulties too. So, but yeah, I can't complain. I have a very privileged life here.
So we lived in the same place for some time, because I was living in the Netherlands during 2021. I was living in Utrecht, right after getting my bachelor, before starting my master's. Wonderful time. I love Utrecht. I love how you can bike everywhere. Like, so different from everything that I'm used to. It's very green. It's very sustainable. Like completely. And it's another world completely.
Yes, I have to say, yeah, my life changed when I got an e-bike. I mean, I was biking. And even though the Netherlands is flat, there are a lot of bridges, and it's also quite windy sometimes, particularly where I'm in Eiburg, which is on the outskirts of Amsterdam. And so an e-bike just changed my life, because then you don't worry so much about steep inclines on bridges or cycling into the wind.
Absolutely. I have to get one too when I'm moving to Germany next semester. They really change your life. Have you find that like the community part of everything that you're doing in the Netherlands is as active as in other places that you mentioned, for example, Vancouver or LA? Because we work with a lot of LA nonprofits and realities. We are based in California, to say so.
Yeah, I mean, well, in fact, the reason that I moved here was because I set up the HIV Justice Network as a Dutch foundation. And I did that because of the amazing HIV-related work that happens here in the Netherlands. So our funder, which is the Robert Carr Fund, our primary fund, the Robert Carr Fund, is based here through AIDS funds, which is the major HIV funding mechanism for the Netherlands. And also, and perhaps even more importantly, the global network of people living with HIV, the secretariat is here. They also have an office in Cape Town in South Africa, but they were founded here. And I used to come a lot to the Netherlands when I worked as a consultant for them. And so, yeah, and there are quite a number of organizations, and particularly after Brexit, which is another reason that I left the UK to register the organization here. A number of other global organizations are beginning to move from the UK to headquarter here, or at least have offices here. Yeah, there is a lot of sort of the global HIV community is here in the Netherlands. Also in The Hague, there are a number of other organizations based there. And it's a small country, so you can see people very easily.
It's very easy to travel from one place to the other. Did you find specifically, like, what are the major differences that you found when moving from Britain to work and to create HIV Justice Network in the Netherlands? Like, did you find any major shift, maybe in mentality, maybe in the way that it was perceived by a bigger audience? Or? Well,
it was a struggle to begin with. When I started being interested in working on HIV criminalization, I was working in for NAM, the largest HIV information charity in the world, I think, but that, based in London. And I think it's a combination of both time and location. So when I started doing this work, very few people were even aware of HIV criminalization, were even interested in it. And I remember the executive director of NAM, Casper Thompson, who tried very hard to fundraise for my work on HIV criminalization, found it very difficult. People were just not interested in this and didn't understand why it was an issue. And as time has gone on, of course, and I would hope in some small part to the work that the HIV Justice Network has done, people have become much more aware of the fact that it's an issue. So, but moving here in order to set up the HIV Justice Foundation, Stichting HIV Justice here in the Netherlands, it felt like a natural progression, and especially because our major funder is here and our key partner is here, it was just, well, of course you need to do this. And certainly working with not just people in the HIV sector, but when we worked with our notary and with our, the accountants and all the people who have to, you work with in order to make an organization really work, or the red tape stuff. They were all, doing pro bono or low bono rates because they all understood how important this work was. And so I guess from that perspective, I wasn't surprised, because in fact, the Netherlands was one of the first countries in the world to actually effectively not have HIV criminalization back in 2005 when the Supreme Court ruled around it. And there haven't been any cases since then. So I guess there's the sense that actually, of course, there shouldn't be HIV criminalization. It's a no-brainer for people in the Netherlands because they haven't experienced it for so long, and it's very much part of the sort of I'd say a sort of a libertarian, slightly centre-left leaning politics that the country has, and I think that's quite different, even particularly from North America, but also other parts of the world too.
Right. We haven't mentioned that, so I'm gonna pop it in here. You're the executive director of the HIV Justice Network, and I'm extremely interested in what you're doing. So I want to start with what would you define what it is HIV criminalization, and what are some examples that our listeners can reflect on and can pinpoint when talking about HIV criminalization?
So I guess the main thing that HIV criminalization describes, I mean, it's become a term that I think a lot of people don't really understand what it is, but it's basically the unjust use of the criminal law that's applied to people living with HIV because of our HIV status. And most of that is around prosecutions for either allegedly not disclosing your HIV positive status before sex, potentially exposing a partner, allegedly transmitting HIV through sex. But there's also other ways that people living with HIV can be criminalized with HIV criminalization for things that would be a minor assault, for example, spitting or biting. The charges are ramped up. If you're a sex worker living with it, just living with HIV, then you're doubly criminalized. And there are HIV specific laws. There are laws specifically written that single out people living with HIV, of which I am one of many millions, for special treatment under the criminal law because of our HIV status. And they are written in a way that often create basically strict liability. So most criminal law, when you have the general criminal law, which is also applied to people living with HIV in many countries, there's a whole range of elements that have to be proven in order to find you guilty. But HIV specific laws actually remove all of that. So it's like, if you don't disclose, regardless of the risk, regardless of whether there was even an allegation of transmission, you're guilty. So in a nutshell is what HIV criminalization is. There are so many examples of unjust, terribly unjust cases. I began by blogging, finding cases and putting together in a blog back in 2007. And now the HIV Justice Network, does much more sophisticated monitoring globally in many languages to find out what's going on. And I'd say, unfortunately, the United States does have some of the most egregious examples. That the US has had a very high number of cases. Half the states have HIV-specific criminal laws, although that number is going down, and we can talk about the amazing advocacy that's been happening there. But you know, the worst examples are always where there was absolutely no risk of anyone getting HIV. So, for example, you know, the Texas, which is interesting because it used to have an HIV-specific criminal law, and it actually repealed its law. It was the first state in the US to repeal its law. And you would think it's great not to have an HIV-specific law. And then what happened is they started to apply the general law to HIV-related cases and left it to the juries, who tend not to be perhaps the most educated in HIV-related issues, to decide whether, for example, is the saliva of someone living with HIV a deadly weapon, and they decided that it was. So you have the case of this of a homeless man of color with mental health issues who spat on a policeman while he was being arrested for vagrancy, and the jury found that his saliva was a deadly weapon, and he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. And I'm assuming he remains there. That was in 2008. And there are many cases of really unjust cases around potential sexual exposure to allegations of non-disclosure. So many cases are, in fact, you know, after a contentious relationship or even a one-night stand, and afterwards the HIV negative partner finds out that their partner was HIV positive and goes to the police for revenge, basically, you know, either because they wanted to see that person again and they weren't interested, or because there was a contentious breakup. And, you know, I'm aware of so many cases of people who've ended up going to prison or pleading guilty because it led to a lesser charge of just a few years in prison and lifetime sex offender status, for example. So a number of states, you're basically a sex offender if you plead guilty to not disclosing your HIV status, even if there was no risk and nobody got infected. So these are just some of the examples. There are so many examples also from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which is the region with the highest number of cases that we're aware of. We used to think it was the US and Canada, and then when we started doing our monitoring in Russian, working with Russian regional partners, we discovered how many more cases there are there too, and so many terrible, terrible cases.
Absolutely. I know it's a very sensitive topic, and of course, what criminalization does is turning around the lives of those individuals and creating jail and prisons as the only basically punishment, as the only and the only way to handle these cases, when in fact we have seen, and I believe we have talked this in so many other interviews, that everything that criminalizing and putting somebody in jail does is to worsen their quality of life, is to not allowing them to pursue maybe a higher education, especially if they're in their late 20s or like mid to late 20s. It's also basically a life sentence to poverty, as we know that it's not an individual problem alone, it's a community problem, especially because I was looking at your work, the work that you have done with MHS, so molecular HIV surveillance, and what it does to a community and what it does to an individual. And I brought down this sentence, which is basically the problem gets shifted from the individual perspective, from a privacy level, on a community perspective of marginalizing and keeping a community where they are, so they're not allowing this community to evolve and have access to funds. And I believe that with molecular HIV surveillance, this problem gets even worse. So if you're basically sentencing this community to not having access to better neighborhoods, to better quality of lives, to better funding, just keeping them there.
Well, I think the problem with molecular HIV surveillance is exacerbated because of HIV criminalization, and it's very much in the US, it is one of the 4 pillars of the epidemic plan. So it's an official way of attempting to use which people, I guess people working in public health believe this is an effective public health tool to be able to track the epidemic and then move resources into where they see what they call clusters of new infections where they perhaps wouldn't see them. And they would claim that actually it benefits marginalized people who aren't linked to care because they may be able to find, for example, a group of people who use drugs or a group of sex workers or some group of trans women and then offer them services. The problem is it also identifies exactly the same groups, and when this information is in the wrong hands or when it's reported in a way that is often stigmatizing, and then what it does, it actually blames these. It appears to blame these particularly marginalized, vulnerable populations for the HIV epidemic, and in fact there are very, very well established tools that the usual interventions that we have to be able to help people access testing, to be able to access treatment and access services, that you don't necessarily need to do molecular HIV surveillance, which is a very expensive and potentially personally invasive tool. Then there's a whole issue around privacy and consent and our bodily autonomy, the repurposing of our blood. So basically, it takes the blood that we give to during our routine monitoring for how well we're doing on treatment, and repurposes it for public health reasons that we don't know about, and then potentially links it back to us. And when there are states that don't have the privacy laws that unfortunately they don't have, we need to have, they can then link that to public health and link to law enforcement. So this is the reason why molecular HIV surveillance is a problem, particularly in the context of HIV, not just HIV criminalization, but also the criminalization of sex work or of drug use, or and just the stigmatization of all the people who are most vulnerable to HIV.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand that basically you would have to think in a bigger picture, and how many resources, how many of these resources are taken away by taken away from a community when starting to identifying these clusters, as you said, and also stigma plays such a huge role, not only in getting access to testing, because I think and many people relate to this. Something that blocks many people from getting a diagnosis, from getting tested, is how would I feel knowing that there is this stigma, there is this. Also, on top of that, there is this criminalization. So I think always about sex workers, and now, for example, in California, this puts the sex worker even in a worse position than it was before, after the mandatory testing, because in California there is this mandatory testing. So basically everything becomes one step harder, one step more difficult. And this stigma is something that we're still fighting. And I love this quote that we have in our community at Until, is that the main problem with HIV is thinking that HIV is not a problem. Like, it's not a problem anymore. Young people don't get tested. Marginalized community and affected communities don't consider it as a problem as it is. Even head of states were like, oh, this is not a problem in the 80s, in the highest point of the epidemic. And then they're like, oh, but we don't talk about this anymore in 2022. I think COVID showed us how you should treat a pandemic, and everything that is not being done with the HIV epidemic until now. So I know that you've collaborated with so many partners around the world. There is South Africa, there is Canada, there is the United States with us, and it's lovely to see all the collective efforts that everyone has been doing when trying to pinpoint the problems with HIV criminalization. And would you like to share some of the main efforts that you've done collaborating with partners around the world when it comes to the HIV Justice Network?
Sure. Well, we wouldn't exist if it weren't for the amazing partners that we work with, both formally and informally. And in fact, the reason the HIV Justice Network moved from being basically a virtual organization, which 10 years ago, it's our 10-year anniversary, with a tiny amount of funding to sort of something that is really now an effective coordinated global response, is because we partnered with a number of really much more well-established regional and global organizations and PLHIV networks. I think my first shout out would be to ARASA, the AIDS and Rights Alliance of Southern Africa, and their former ED, Michaela Clayton, who became she, along with the current chair of the HIV Justice Network, Richard Elliott, who was then the executive director of the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, they did so much of the groundwork before I was even involved in this. I mean, I was a blogger and a journalist and an activist on the outside, but they did so much work. So partnering with ARASA, first of all, and they became the lead of this first consortium that we put together to get funding from the Robert Carr Fund for a global coordinated effort. And the work that ARASA has done, starting in the mid-2000s, when they were really the first to raise the awareness that HIV criminalization is a problem for women rather than a solution. So across sub-Saharan Africa, so at the beginning of the 21st century, there were no HIV criminalization laws. And within 10 years, and a lot of it due to funding from USAID and the exporting of the idea that HIV criminalization is a good idea, 30 countries across sub-Saharan Africa ended up having HIV criminalization laws. And they were the first to raise the awareness that, in fact, instead of protecting women, which is what people thought these laws would do, women ended up being the first to be being prosecuted, because of the women are usually the first to know their HIV status in a relationship because of antenatal testing. The moment they're pregnant, they're basically, if not coerced, then definitely strongly persuaded to take an HIV test. And the first person in a relationship, often there, who tests positive, might not be the first person to have HIV, but the legal system in not just across Africa, but everywhere, just assumes the first person to be tested then must be the person that passes on HIV to the other partner. So they made this issue very much a feminist issue, a sexual and reproductive health and rights issue, a bodily autonomy issue. It helped me understand how HIV criminalization is so much more than just about a person's HIV status. And so ARASA has continued to do incredible work there. And we also partner with another amazing organization in Southern Africa called SALT, the Southern Africa Litigation Center. And together they have done incredible work and supported the repeal of the HIV-specific law in Zimbabwe, which finally happened at the beginning of this year. It was a very long process. It was so fantastic that in a country like Zimbabwe, which has an awful lot of political turmoil and difficulties, and many other key populations are criminalized, but we managed to persuade parliamentarians that law was doing a lot more harm than good. So that's fantastic. We also work with incredible partners in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the Eurasian Women's Network on AIDS, and their chair, Sveta Moroz, is in Ukraine and has continued to lead and do this work whilst Russia is illegally invading her country. Mm-hmm. And it's unbelievable what they have been able to do and what they continue to do as well. We also work in Canada. I mentioned they used to be called the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. They're now the HIV Legal Network. They have had such an amazing journey because HIV criminalization in Canada is absolutely horrendous. And but they've done so much work. They've tried every avenue to try and improve the legal environment, and it's a slow but finally getting somewhere. There is guidance now for prosecutors in a number of provinces and territories, and they're about to launch at the AIDS conference this month. It's this month, isn't it? The end of July, a community statement from advocates across Canada about what they want to see for law reform, because they're going to have to reform the actual criminal code in Canada and not an HIV specific law as many US states need to do. And they're just brilliant. So I've learned so much from them. Then of course our partners in the US, the CIRA Project, and also Positive Women's Network USA, the work that they do, first of all, the intersectional lens, the racial justice lens, the feminist lens is just amazing. The work that CIRA has done in bringing the voices of survivors of HIV criminalization to the forefront hasn't just changed hearts and minds in the US, but has actually done it globally, and helped to really change the dialogue on what HIV criminalization means. It used to be, we used to just talk about it in terms of laws and policy, impact on public health, and we talk about human rights, but we never talked about the individual humans. And the work that CIRA has done by bringing forward the voices of survivors of HIV criminalization, humanizing, that's how we started our conversation, humanizing, realizing that this is about people's lives. That's incredible. And then there's the global network of people living with HIV who began doing this work globally around the same time I was blogging. And they do incredible work, particularly on they have a seat at the table, which is fantastic, at a lot of the high level places at UNAIDS, at WHO, and they bring this issue to those spaces and do amazing advocacy there. So those are just some of our partners.
Absolutely. No, it's amazing to have a community that supports and stands with you even in times of crisis, such as this one. And of course, with everything happening in Ukraine, and also you mentioned before bodily autonomies, with everything happening in the States, which is something that as working in the nonprofit, as a woman, as an ally, as part of the LGBT community, is like everything that's happening affects us so much. And of course, it may not be easy to see the interconnection between the HIV criminalization and the Roe versus Wade law that's been overturned in the States recently, but it always comes back to bodily autonomy, to independence, to freedom, and to privacy. So I believe it's something that has been flushed away and like been completely removed when it comes both to the right to have a safe access to abortion and the right to have your HIV status protected and not criminalized. Let me ask you a very, I know it can be a provocative question, but I want this interview to be accessible to everyone. People like me, students, professionals, people that have never heard about HIV criminalization and are wondering what is that. I think the Netherlands is such a great example of what will the world be without HIV criminalization, because you said it's not like that since 2005. So based on the example of the Netherlands, what would you think the world would look like? Okay. What do you think the world will look like without HIV criminalization?
Well, for the first of all, people living with HIV will feel much more secure and supported and not be looking over their shoulders all the time. It will mean that we'll be able to get the support we need in order to have the kind of relationships that we want, to have the kind of sex that we want, to have the kind of families that we want, without fear that we're going to be judged or reported to the police and then criminalized for wanting to live the lives that we need to live in dignity. there will be, that's the goal, of course. That's the goal of life without HIV, without criminalization. Also, criminalization is that state-sponsored stigma, but we also need to remove societal stigma. Stigma in the healthcare setting is still problematic for many people, even if there isn't criminalization. Stigma in society, stigma, need to be able to have the jobs that they want to have and the families and the relationships they want to have, and not fear of being judged. Obviously, criminalization is that sharp end of the stick, but so a world without HIV criminalization, I think, can probably only happen, though, if we work at the same time on reducing HIV-related stigma and associated discrimination. They're all part of a continuum. And so it's about understanding that HIV is just another communicable disease, but it's not easy to pass on, certainly not like COVID or monkeypox or even TB, and those aren't criminalized. And it's about understanding that we just are people like everybody else who just want to get on with our lives and without interference from the state. So a world without HIV criminalization, I think, is achievable. It is part of the goals, the UNAIDS strategy, the UN high-level meeting goals. It's all part of the goals. We're meant to have fewer than 10% of countries without punitive laws and policies by 2025. We aren't going to reach that goal, but let's just try. So a world without HIV criminalization basically means that we live our lives in dignity and with joy and without fear. That would be amazing.
Absolutely. It's lovely to end on this note. Thank you so much for the time, for making it today, for taking part in our Empowering Voices series. And it was a very, very interesting conversation. It completely changed my outlook on HIV criminalization and why we should aspire to live in a world without it. Let's hope that with everything going on, HIV Justice Network continues what you're doing is amazing as always. And I really look forward for Until and the HIV Justice Network to keep collaborating in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Until There's a Cure.
Okay. Bye. Enjoy the great rest of your day. And we're finally in the same time zone, so I can finally say it and without making mistakes.
That's so great, Sharon. Do let me know, of course, when it's Absolutely. Up, and we'll use our social media to elevate the video blog. Okay, thanks, Sharon. Have a good day.
Bye. You too.
Bye-bye.